Hello everyone, welcome to this session 1.6 on sustainable finance. My name's Rachel Child. I'm Principal Consultant focusing on greenhouse gas emissions and infrastructure for Partnerships for Infrastructure. In this session, we're going to cover the spectrum of capital and different investment approaches, the rise in environmental, social and governance, ESG, and responsible investing, sustainable finance and climate finance, the drivers for the rise in these different investment approaches, climate finance taxonomies, and finally, we'll finish with some case studies to show how this all works in practice. First, a little bit about who we are. Partnerships for Infrastructure is delivered by 5 organisations working as one team, united by a shared commitment to quality infrastructure development in Southeast Asia. Our hub office is in Bangkok, and we have staff and experts located throughout the region and in Australia. Partnerships for Infrastructure is led by the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and delivered by EY, the Asia Foundation, Adam Smith International and Ninety One. Together we strive to ensure our engagement with the region is world-class. Right, moving to the main part of the presentation. Our first slide here shows the spectrum of capital, looking at different investment approaches and different financial and impact goals. So if we start at the left-hand side of the slide, we have traditional investment approaches, which aim to deliver competitive, risk-adjusted financial returns, but don't really consider any potential negative outcomes for people or planet. If we move one box to the right, we get to responsible investing, which still aims to deliver competitive risk-adjusted financial returns, but also tries to avoid harm and mitigate risks and potential negative impacts on people and planet. One step to the right again, we have sustainable investing, which as well as delivering competitive risk-adjusted financial returns and reducing and mitigating risks, also looks to benefit stakeholders and deliver positive outcomes for people and planet. One step to the right again is impact-driven investments, which are investments that can tolerate higher risk and deliver below market returns, but also contribute to solutions and have a material positive outcome for underserved groups of people or the planet. And to the far right, we have philanthropic investments, which are grant investments and can accept full loss of capital, but are aiming to have a significant contribution to solutions and improving outcomes for underserved people and the planet. If we look at the first category of investing, ESG and responsible investing, we see that globally there's a trend for increased amounts of ESG investing. ESG assets are expected to exceed $53 trillion by 2025, more than a third of total projected assets under management. And while the start of ESG investing was in Europe, the next wave is expected to be in Asia. The graph at the bottom of the slide is OECD data and looks at the coverage of ESG ratings for public companies. The yellow line is the world and the green line is selected economies in Asia and the Pacific. And we can see that generally there is a rising trend, and particularly the green line over the past couple of years. And we expect this trend to increase. So looking in more detail at what ESG investing is, we have E, environmental, and this is looking at managing risks around greenhouse gas emissions, water use, waste management, and biodiversity. We have S, social, and this is managing risks around health and safety, workers' rights, land acquisition, and just transition, amongst other things. This S part is the most difficult to analyse and integrate into investment approaches, but it's growing in importance to end investors. And G is governance, and this is looking at board compensation, dealings with government, ethical business conduct, amongst other things. The next box to the right, if you remember from that first slide, is sustainable finance, looking at, as well as managing risks, delivering some positive outcomes. And we've got different instruments being developed to support different sustainability objectives. For example, we have green bonds and green loans, and this is where the proceeds of the bond are to deliver dedicated environmental benefits. So we might see proceeds being used for renewable energy or low carbon transport, such as electric vehicles, measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We might see then social bonds and social loans, and this is where proceeds of the bond are dedicated to deliver social benefits. So this might be investments in healthcare or affordable housing. We have a growth of sustainability bonds and sustainability loans, and this incorporates both green and social benefits in one instrument. So this might be where the proceeds of the bond are used, for example, for affordable housing that's also energy efficient, or in the manufacture of renewable energy technologies where there's a particular focus on employing women. And then the final category here we have is sustainability linked bonds. And this is where the proceeds of the bonds are used for general corporate purposes, not for any particular infrastructure that's been identified, but that the bond instrument includes sustainability performance targets, and achievement of these targets is linked to step downs in the interest rates associated. And this is data from the Climate Bonds Initiative on the use of green, social and sustainability instruments in the region. And we can see over the past 5 years, there's been a generally rising trend in the use of these instruments. I think last year in 2022, there was a bit of a dip from global economic conditions, rising interest rates, rising inflation rates. But generally, the trend is that these instruments are increasing, and we expect this trend to carry on. One particular type of sustainable finance is climate finance, and we see a particular growth in this as well. So climate finance falls into two buckets. We have mitigation climate finance, which is focused on reducing emissions and enhancing sinks of greenhouse gases. And then we have climate finance associated with adaptation and resilience. So this is aimed at reducing vulnerability and increasing resilience of human and ecological systems to the impacts of climate change. So over the past 10 years, the amount of climate finance has almost doubled. But we will need a much further increase in the amount of climate finance by the end of this decade if we're to limit temperature increases to 1.5 degrees, which is what the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change tells us is needed to meet Paris Agreement goals. There's a particular need for increased climate finance from the private sector. Most climate finance to date has been for renewable energy, which is the red portion of the graph. But increasingly, climate finance is being directed to other sectors, and the fastest growing sector is transport. That's the blue section of the graph there, with the growth of investments in electric vehicles and electric vehicle infrastructure. Climate finance for other sectors is really lagging. So climate finance is much less available for projects in agriculture, forestry, land use change, water and wastewater. Similarly, finance for adaptation and resilience is also lagging behind other sectors, but we see an increasing drive from investors to look for investment opportunities in these other areas. So what's driving the increase in sustainable finance and climate finance? Well, we're seeing a lot of net zero commitments. We're seeing many banks and investors committing to aligning net lending and investment portfolios with net zero emissions by 2050, in line with Paris Agreement goals. We have groups of investors such as the Net Zero Banking Alliance and the Net Zero Asset Owner Alliance, with very high membership globally. And this is a quote from a recent publication. Rather than merely avoiding investments in fossil fuel businesses, investors are actively pursuing opportunities involving decarbonisation. In the public sector too, multilateral development banks, so the World Bank, IFC, ADB, have made commitments for the amount of climate financing they will provide for both mitigation of greenhouse gas emissions and adaptation to the impacts of climate change. Similarly, European development finance institutions have committed to reaching net zero emissions across their portfolios by 2050. So in both the public and private sector, we're seeing financial institutions actively looking for climate finance opportunities. Alongside these commitments, we're seeing increasing regulation and guidance around climate and ESG disclosures. Many of them are based on the recommendations of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which sets a framework for what needs to be included in these disclosures. So it requests information on governance, how climate-related risks and opportunities are considered at senior management and board level, how climate risks and opportunities might impact on an organisation's strategy and planning, how climate risks are identified, assessed and managed in an organisation, and then what metrics and targets are used to assess progress. And we have some examples there of ESG disclosure guidance by some countries in the region. And again, we expect this trend of disclosure guidance and regulation to increase. So we've talked about the increase in climate finance, but this leads to the next question about what counts. What counts as climate finance? What type of investments can be included? And again, we see these two key buckets. So we have climate finance around low carbon infrastructure and infrastructure that would reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. And then the other part of climate finance around increasing resilience to the impacts of climate change. So looking at low carbon infrastructure first, taxonomies or lists and methodologies of what can be included have been developed. These have been developed at a regional level, at a country level, and also some funders have developed taxonomies. And while they're all slightly different, there is a lot of commonality in the type of measures and investments that can be included. So thinking of low carbon infrastructure by sector, in the transport sector, eligible technologies generally include non-motorised transport, so walking, cycling, electric vehicles for passengers or freight, and then charging infrastructure. In some cases, trains and buses powered by diesel or petrol can also be included if, for example, they're carrying passengers or freight that might have otherwise travelled by air, which is a higher emitting mode of transport. In the power and energy sector, renewable energy technologies are generally eligible, so wind, solar, wave power, transmission and distribution infrastructure and smart grids and storage are usually eligible, and other technologies, for example, hydropower and biomass, are often also eligible as well. In other sectors, we see buildings built to green design standards like IFC EDGE being eligible, water supply and wastewater treatment facilities, and waste collection and treatment facilities that divert waste from landfill, and also infrastructure that recovers and utilises landfill gas. In terms of climate and disaster resilient infrastructure, this is less on a sector basis, but more in terms of a process. So we would generally see that the financiers would look to see an assessment that would include identification of exposure to climate risks, for example, if the infrastructure is in a place at risk of flooding or drought. And then how management of these risks has been included in the design of the infrastructure to minimise exposure to the risks and make the infrastructure more resilient. For example, measures to manage exposure to flooding. Would also look to include measures to think about impacts on the wider system and impacts on the vulnerability and resilience of the people using the infrastructure or the people living in the vicinity of the infrastructure. And then finally, alignment with national policy and strategies like nationally determined contributions to the Paris Agreement, adaptation plans, or climate change action plans. So next, I thought it'd be interesting to look at some case studies to see how this all works in practice. Our first one is BTS Group in Thailand. BTS Group develop and operate mass transit systems, amongst other things. They have a very strong sustainability strategy with environmental, economic and social goals. They've issued both green bonds and sustainability-linked bonds. They've raised nearly 32 billion Thai baht through green bonds, and this has been allocated to specific green projects, including new transport infrastructure and clean transportation. And in this, they demonstrated that people travelling on the new mass transit system would have otherwise travelled by private vehicles, so that the new infrastructure represented a reduction in emissions. They recently raised 11 billion Thai baht through sustainability-linked bonds. And in this type of bond, as we discussed earlier, the proceeds can be used for general purposes rather than being allocated to specific infrastructure. But as part of the bond issuance, BTS Group set KPIs around energy efficiency, so the electricity consumption per car kilometre, and renewable energy consumption. And progress towards these KPIs is assessed by third parties each year, and if they're not met, then BTS Group will face financial penalties. Our next case study is from Vietnam, an EVN Finance Green Bond. So Garanco, which is part of the Private Infrastructure Development Group, which is also part funded by the Australian government, provided a almost $50 million partial credit guarantee to support a green bond issuance by EVN Finance joint stock company in Vietnam. This was the first onshore local currency internationally verified green bond in Vietnam. The bond proceeds will allow EVN Finance to issue longer-term loans to finance capital expenditure of green infrastructure. In particular, it's going to be used to provide loans towards rooftop and ground-mounted solar in Vietnam. So these first two examples were around climate finance being used for mitigation to reduce emissions of greenhouse gases. But this next case study is showing how climate finance can be used for climate resilient infrastructure. So this is looking at a port in Nauru. And this port is very exposed to extreme weather events caused increasingly by climate change. And this was leading to delays and sometimes even complete port shutdowns at some points in the year. Offshore loading and unloading was becoming more and more hazardous and difficult, and it was also leading to rising shipping costs. So the Green Climate Fund and the ADB supported the construction of a climate resilient port that can operate all year round. The port includes various design features to make the port more resilient to the impacts of climate change and the extreme weather events that climate change is bringing. While the port, the main focus was on climate resilience, it also led to some reductions in greenhouse gas emissions because ships will spend less time at sea, leading to a reduction in fuel used. And our final case study is from a Partnerships for Infrastructure activity, Cambodia Public-Private Partnerships. P4I is working with Cambodia's Ministry of Economy and Finance to improve financing and cost recovery in the wastewater sector, to strengthen public investment management and build capacity to attract more quality private investment through PPPs. P4I is also assisting in developing and implementing a capacity building programme for climate resilient PPPs. This programme aims at including disaster risk reduction, climate change and sustainability and ESG themes in the PPP development lifecycle, and also embedding them through training and methodologies. These building blocks are crucial to creating the best environment for PPPs, including legislative and regulatory frameworks, managing risk, engaging stakeholders, and accessing finance. So thank you. I hope this session has been useful in improving understanding about different types of investment approaches, the rise in ESG and responsible investing, and also sustainable finance and climate finance, and considering the type of investments that might qualify for climate finance. Thank you very much.